Good evening, everyone. My name is Boomslang. Tonight, I'll be covering a Reddit post called the World War II Mysteries and Obscurities Iceberg. A link to the original post is available in the description. For those who don't know what an internet iceberg is, it's a hulking mass of frozen water far too large to be called an ice cube. I hope you enjoy the video. I'll be starting at the second tier. Tier 2. Super Soldiers. This had a different title, but I doubt you would even see this on your feed if I used it in the first 30 seconds of this video. Despite my efforts, the first entry covers drugs, so I guess that was pointless. Both the Allied and Axis forces issued performance-enhancing drugs to some of their units. German troops were issued a drug called Pervitin, which was in fact an amphetamine, while Allied soldiers were often given a cocktail of stimulants that included coke. These drugs were used to relieve battlefield stress and to deaden the effects of PTSD. A pharmaceutical arms race continued throughout the war, as both sides attempted to grace their forces with compounds that would grant them improved capabilities. The Germans took their research as far as they could, and other forces embraced them later on. Pervitin was initially marketed in the 30s as a pick-me-up that could help students stay up late and have more energy for their exams. Axis scientists quickly saw the usefulness of this drug, and one Reich doctor named Otto Ranke said it was an excellent substance for rousing a weary squad. It was widely distributed to Luftwaffe pilots to keep sleep and hunger at bay. Many pilots were expected to perform well under constant stress during the Battle of Britain, so many were given liberal supplies of amphetamines to keep them in battle. The British estimated that roughly 35 million Pervitin tablets were distributed among 3 million pilots and soldiers between April and June 1940. Wehrmacht records during the campaign to conquer France recorded their troops fighting and marching for 10 consecutive days, with almost no rest, while constantly ingesting these drugs. British intelligence received reports of the Expeditionary Forces' encounters with Nazis who had superhuman resistance to G-forces and drugged-up paratroopers who charged their positions in a complete rage. Operation Downfall. Operation Downfall was the plan proposed by the US Army to create an operation that would conquer the Japanese home islands before the 2 atomic bombs were dropped. The Navy wanted to mount a massive blockade and following bombardment of the islands, but the Army wanted an early assault on Kyushu Island and another on the main island of Honshu. Nimitz, the Navy commander, agreed with the Army's plan, and Operation Downfall's blueprints were drawn up. The operation included 2 smaller assaults, codenamed Operation Olympic, an assault on Kyushu, and Operation Coronet, an assault on Honshu. 767,000 men were planned to be dispatched in Operation Olympic. The recent campaign to take the island of Okinawa was used to draw up an idea of what the casualties would be. A 35% casualty rate was set as the benchmark, meaning 268,000 men would die. The Japanese High Command planned to mount a ferocious defense of that island, planning to set 3 million people in a plan to break American morale by not giving an inch. Japanese planners had built positions in areas outside the range of naval shellfire, and had areas prepared in many caves deep in the interior. In the summer of 1945, Japanese propaganda proclaimed slogans like, "The sooner the Americans come, the better. 100 million die proudly." Mystery Division. On January 17, 1945, elements of the US Army's 12th Armored Division, called the Hellcats, went missing in a town called Herlesheim in the Alsace region of France. The 43rd Tank Battalion was sent to push the Germans out of this town, and were never heard from again. A few heavily distorted radio calls were received from the unit, and then complete silence following that. This unit was fairly experienced, having seen action throughout France and the battle for the Ardennes. This little town was full of fanatical SS troopers, and past attacks to secure the bridge in the town had been pushed back by doped-up stormtroopers supported by heavy mechanized armor. The 43rd was thought to be fit for this job, and was sent to secure this bridge before contact with the 43rd was lost. Rescue missions were sent the next day and found burnt-out Sherman tanks and no survivors. German counterattacks were being mounted nearby, so the rescue parties quickly retreated back to their lines. The tanks were noted to have been arranged in a defensive position and surrounded by dead enemy vehicles in foxholes. Later investigation revealed that the tank battalion had gone into the town and took fire from German 88s in armor. They quickly retreated to the outskirts before infantry equipped with anti-tank weapons ambushed them and took out the survivors. Fanta Creation. Fanta has some deep lore. This beverage was invented by the Coca-Cola Company in the 1920s and marketed to Germany in the midst of World War II. It was not that appetizing at the time, thanks to wartime restrictions. It consisted of leftover apple fibers and a byproduct of cheese known as whey. Just to clarify, it was better before the war. It was like apple flavored. They ran out of stuff and they had to use all this other stuff during World War II. It had a different taste than its current incarnation, which debuted in Italy in 1955. Unknown photographer. This refers to a German journalist who'd done a lot of work for the party. Henrik Ross was a former press and sports photographer whose work was invaluable for the Nazi occupiers in Poland. He was sent to the Jewish ghetto areas to record the productivity of the workers. However, he was determined to do something besides record propaganda for the occupiers. Unbeknownst to the authorities, Ross actively snuck out of his assigned area and took photos of life in the ghettos. Over the next years, he took some 6,000 negatives of the horrible conditions in the ghettos and buried them near his home. Ross left his home and later exhumed the box of photos when he returned after the war. These photos serve as a tangible record of what the Nazis did to the Jewish community in Poland. Niihau Incident. During the briefings for the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese pilots were instructed to crash land on the island of Niihau. They were experiencing mechanical trouble. It was a small outcropping 30 minutes away from where the attack would be taking place. Pilots were told it would be covertly picked up by a sub if they landed there. One of the Japanese pilots later made an emergency landing on the supposedly uninhabited island, but was surprised that it wasn't uninhabited like the military planners had thought. It was undeveloped, but had around 200 residents at that time. The pilot, a man named Shigenori Nishikaichi, was found by a Hawaiian ranch hand. The ranch hand, named Kalia Hano, took the pilot's pistol and documents. The islanders weren't aware of the Pearl Harbor attack, so they took care of him as they would any friendly downed pilot. The man continued to live in their village as a friend, and no sub showed up to rescue him, as they'd been reassigned to other duties at the time. Very soon after, the residents heard a radio broadcast about the attack, and realized they had an enemy pilot living among them. The villagers placed him under house arrest, but Nishikaichi managed to sneak out one night and destroy the remains of his crashed plane. A local Japanese beekeeper, sympathetic to Imperial Japan, ended up smuggling a shotgun and a pistol into the hands of the pilot, and the pair escaped and threatened to shoot the ranch hand who had the documents if he didn't hand them over. Kalia Hano refused, and the pilot took a pot shot at him with the shotgun, but missed. Kalia Hano got away and was able to warn everyone. Some of the residents built a fire to signal a nearby island, while the ranch hand took a 10-hour-long trip to find help in the nearby islands. While he was gone, the pilot went on a rampage, taking hostages, asking for Kalia Hano's whereabouts, even burning Kalia Hano's home down. While he took hostages, The others pretended to look for the ranch hand to buy time. One of the villagers made a move to attack the pilot, but the Japanese aviator saw him and opened fire. This made the villager's wife enraged, and she grabbed a rock and smashed it into the pilot's head. The two of them finished the pilot off. The military showed up later, and Kalehano was awarded the Medal of Honor. Ratlines. Ratlines were the contingency protocols that allowed many senior Nazi officials to escape Allied forces to reach South America and other places of refuge. These were initiated by a large group of different institutions in the German High Command, and many who were sympathetic to their cause or enjoyed the power they had during German occupation helped to smuggle these war criminals out of Europe in the late 40s. Battle of Castle Itter. This confrontation has received significant coverage in a few YouTube videos, most notably Wendigoons. The battle to liberate high-ranking French political figures took place between a force composed of renegade German soldiers and US forces who were allied and a detachment of SS. The Allies captured the fortress and united with the Germans to turn back the SS. They were able to hold out until an American armored column arrived to help. Who betrayed Jean Moulin? Moulin was one of the highest-ranking members of the French resistance, who distinguished himself by aiding his countrymen in their fight against tyranny. He was later betrayed, ambushed, and turned over to the Gestapo, where he endured a brutal series of interrogations. He refused to tell any secrets and managed to survive the war before dying in the 60s. Many people have different theories as to who exactly betrayed him, ranging from the communists to a mole in the resistance. Foo Fighters. This is an American band led by the former Nirvana drummer Dave Grohl. That's it, there's no other implications. This refers to a series of lights that followed the airmen of the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, which was seeing action in the Rhine Valley in the European theater. The pilots reportedly saw between 8 to 10 bright orange lights appear near one plane's wing, maintaining the same speed as the plane, and then drifting off into the distance. They didn't show up on radar, and soon gathered a large following after these reports were given to the press. The Army later ruled that these were the result of a light phenomena. Anne Frank's diary was changed. The famous diary of the young Anne Frank is one of the most famous artifacts from the Holocaust. Her writings were published after her death from typhus in a concentration camp. Her writing was altered by her father, who survived the war. A couple of entries that included dirty jokes and stuff relating to puberty were removed to slightly alter that aspect of Anne's growth over the time she was in hiding. Additional mentions of her parents' declining relationship were also taken out. Amber Room. This entry refers to a beautiful jewel-encrusted room that was given to Peter the Great in 1716 to celebrate peace between Prussia and the Russians. It was often referred to as the eighth wonder of the world. It was crafted by a German Baroque sculptor named Andreas Schluter and shipped to Russia in 18 separate boxes. It was installed in the Winter House in St. Petersburg. It later was moved again to the Catherine Palace and given extensive renovations over the ensuing years. It survived the 1917 revolution, was subsequently looted by the invading forces of Germany in Operation Barbarossa. The officials in charge of the occupation declared that since it was made by Germans, it was supposed to be used by Germans. It was later shipped to a museum in Königsberg Castle, now Kaliningrad. The museum director was a huge fan of amber, like he was obsessed with it, so he spent a lot of time studying its composition and history over the next 2 years. Like, he literally just spent hours looking at it. It was moved in 1943, before a massive bombing raid occurred, and the contents were lost to time. People believe the boxes holding the amber panels were either destroyed in the bombing or somewhere in the bottom of the Baltic Sea. A replica was later built over the course of 25 years and dedicated in a ceremony involving Putin and the German Chancellor. Tier 3. Wojtec. Wojtec was a 500-pound Syrian black bear who was adopted as a cub by a group of Polish POWs who were in transit between a Siberian gulag and the Allied front lines in Italy. This Polish unit had been allowed to fight as part of a pact between the Allies and Stalin, in which captured Poles would be allowed to fight against the Axis. This cub was discovered by a Polish artillery unit and nursed back to health with the help of condensed milk that the soldiers had put in empty vodka bottles. The bear grew up and developed a smoking habit. Wojtek would accept lit cigarettes, take a puff, and then promptly swallow them. He also enjoyed any beer the soldiers would give him, would actually drink from the bottle. While in the Middle East, the bear was recorded breaking into the communal showers and turning them on by himself, which was an issue in the midst of the necessary water rations that were being enforced. During the Battle of Monte Cassino, the bear was said to have been helping the crews by carrying live ammunition for the crews. After the war, the Polish lobbied to have him sent somewhere besides Soviet-controlled Poland, and he lived out the rest of his days in Scotland before passing away in 1963. Lost Polish National Treasures. There are a variety of Polish artifacts that were taken by the Germans and Soviets in the opening months and following occupation of this country. Some of the more noteworthy stolen items out of the extensive list include the royal casket. This casket was confiscated from the Temple to Sibyl in Puławy. It contained 73 precious Polish relics that had massive cultural value. Lauri Torni. This man has had multiple videos made about his life. He provides some interesting content. Torni was a Finnish soldier, often called the Soldier of Three Armies. He also had his own Sabaton song. He fought against the USSR in a Finnish Jaeger commando unit during the Winter War in 1939. The Finnish military fought hard, but despite the massive losses they inflicted on the Russians could simply replace the men and equipment they lost in each engagement. In the end, the Finnish agreed to the Russian terms, and an area called the Karelian Isthmus was given to Russia, along with a variety of other land concessions. The Finns living in these areas were given just 2 weeks to evacuate, and Torni's family joined the refugees who retreated across the new border into Finland. Torni later joined a SS unit in 1941, not for the ideology, but for a chance to receive top-tier training and fight the Russians again. I couldn't do justice to all of his exploits, but Torni saw active duty throughout the Eastern Front, gaining infamy among the Soviets. He later left the SS and made his way back to Finland. He later had to flee his home country after the end of the war. Finland remained independent, but the communist-controlled Finnish secret police was on the heels of Torni. He later went on to join the newly formed U.S. Army Special Forces and saw combat in Vietnam before going missing near the Ho Chi Minh Trail in 1965. He was presumed dead. Despite multiple searches of the crash site, his body was never located. John Rabe. John Rabe was a German businessman who established a safe zone during the Japanese massacres in Nanjing. He was the leader of the Nanjing Nazi Party, but did his best to help the communities around him. He helped establish a zone where Chinese civilians could seek refuge from the horrendous fighting between the Japanese and the Chinese forces. He later helped harbor hundreds of Chinese women, protect them from the Japanese soldiers, and crowds of people took shelter in his backyard during the events of the massacre. Fate of Alois Brunner. Brunner was an Austrian SS commander who was the right-hand man of the architect of the final solution, Adolf Eichmann. Over 128,000 deaths were attributed to this man, while he oversaw the operations of the Drancy internment camp outside of Paris. He was often sent out by Eichmann when his boss thought that not enough Jews had been collected. His campaigns were brutal, as he actively went to an area called the Riviera to drag the Jews seeking refuge in Italian territory into camps like Dachau and Auschwitz. Brunner escaped the hunters who were sent to bring him to trial, and lived under an assumed name throughout Europe. A Ratline later helped him escape to Syria, where he helped develop and oversee various torture methods for those the regime deemed dangerous. He survived 2 Israeli attacks in 1961 and 1980. He was reported to have died in pain and squalor in 2001. An accredited Nazi hunter who was assigned to the case reported that Brunner had later been shunned by the Syrian regime and had passed away in an apartment block while suffering from great hunger and poverty. It was a fitting death for a dishonorable man. Those better that if he had been brought to justice. Germans in Tibet. In January of 1939, a small group of Waffen SS troops were sent to Tibet. They were deployed to take on a mission to locate a lost Aryan race that was said to be somewhere in a Tibetan plateau. They didn't accomplish much besides a correspondence between the German and Tibetan delegations, taking time to document and take ancient artifacts from the Himalayas. The small group was supposed to gather more evidence of a lost Proto-European race of superhumans, but quickly ran out of time and had to retreat back to Germany as the invasion of Poland. Chuchijima Incident. Heads up, this entry has some disturbing content, so skip ahead to about 2 minutes if you don't want to hear about cannibalism or stuff like that. On September 2nd, 1944, a group of pilots took to the skies in the Pacific Theater to engage the Japanese. This incident was considered so horrifying that the US Navy redacted the details of the event for decades. Chuchijima was a tiny island located 500 miles south of Japan. It contained a radio tower that was considered to be essential to the Japanese communications array. Over 25,000 troops and heavy anti-aircraft systems protected an island only about twice the size of Central Park in New York City. American aircraft carriers were deployed to the area, and multiple waves were sent out to take the site with limited success. On the second day, another wave was sent out, a flight that included a man who would later become a US president, George H.W. Bush. Multiple planes were shot down, and Bush and other crews were shot down in their attempt to take out the tower. Bush landed on the ocean and escaped the fate of 8 other men who were forced to bail out over the island. The other airmen were captured and died from ritual beheading and bamboo spears. Later on, the Japanese general ordered the bodies to be dug up and eaten by the Japanese officers. Their organs were served, along with sake, to the senior officials on the island. The men who had eaten were later charged with these crimes at the POW trials in Guam, although the men said it was less a crime of hunger, more an act to express their frustration on Japan's continued losses during the war. Lake Toplitz treasure. In the last days of World War II, a group of Nazis dumped a large collection of crates into the nearby Lake Toplitz. It was rumored to be gold, but people have guessed the boxes to contain everything from documents to forged currency. In the 1950s, a West German diving team was sent and retrieved 15 boxes that were found to contain millions of pounds of British banknotes. These were most likely part of a German operation to flood the British economy with thousands of counterfeit banknotes. Amelia Earhart spy theory. For those that don't know, the accomplished aviatrix Amelia Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, went missing after taking off from New Guinea in 1937. One theory holds that this aviator was in fact a spy for the American government who was taken out by the Japanese or crashed on the way to her next stop. Others claimed that Earhart was captured by the Japanese government and died while imprisoned. Nanjing Game Contest. This was a competition between 2 Japanese officers who challenged each other to see who could cut down 100 people using a sword. In the end, the men ended up extending the event to see who could strike down 150 people. This event was popularized in Japanese propaganda, and these articles were later used to accuse and execute the two officers in 1948. Paul Ogorzow. Nicknamed the S-Bahn Killer, Ogorzow was a party member and German citizen who lurked in abandoned rail carriages and attacked single women whose husbands were away serving in the military. Born in 1912, Ogorzow had been a faithful member of the Nazi Party since 1931. In 1934, he began working as a plate layer for the National Rail Company, surveying the installation of multiple rail systems in Berlin. He became familiar with the layout of the metro area and soon settled in the area along with his small family. Ogorzow initiated his attacks in the second-class compartments of the trains he worked on, as they were sparsely used by Berliners. Over the course of 1940, over 28 incidents occurred of women being attacked and bludgeoned in the trains and railway cars in the metro, many of which have been attributed to the S-Bahn Killer. Eventually, the police learned of Ogorczow's suspicious activity at work. In 1941, he was brought in for questioning. He later claimed that he had been conducting an affair, which was the primary motivator for his strange behavior. The police were willing to buy that story, but analysis of the clothing he was wearing during the interview revealed microscopic blood stains on the hem and crotch area. Ogorzow claimed that the stains were from his sick wife, where he had injured his finger, but the police realized that this was evidence of a violent assault. After days of questioning, he cracked and confessed to the murders throughout the previous 2 years. He was put on trial for the deaths of 8 women and the attempted murder of another 6. On July 19, 1941, Ogorzow was sentenced to death by guillotine. August Landmesser. Landmesser is the subject of a photograph in which a single man in a crowd of workers refuses to salute the Führer. August Landmesser was married to a Jewish woman. He had been a superficial member of the party who was kicked out after becoming engaged to Irma Eckler, and their application for marriage was refused by the state. The couple later had 2 daughters named Ingrid and Irene, and attempted to flee Germany and cross over into Denmark. August was captured and imprisoned, and warned not to engage with his wife. He was arrested a month later for refusing to obey, and sentenced to a concentration camp. He was never seen again. His wife later passed away in another camp, but their daughters were hidden by Allied sympathizers and would survive the war. Hitler's missing globe. This refers to the Columbus globe for state and industry leaders, an enormous model of the world designed for the leaders of the Nazi Party. Only 2 copies were ever produced, both the size of around a Volkswagen Kübelwagen. It's known as to where the globe that lied in Hitler's office went. The last photographs of it were taken by Russian troops in Berlin in 1945, so it was most likely captured by Russian forces. Hiroo Onada's Holdout. Onada was one of the last Japanese soldiers to surrender, surrendering in March 1974 after his 52nd birthday. He only left his post after his former commander flew to near where he was located and reversed the orders he had issued in 1945. Onada had refused to disobey the orders given to him up until that point, despite multiple searches and the encouragement of his family to surrender. His 30-year-old uniform was still in good condition when he gave up his weapon. Onada had spent the last 30 years living off the land and pillaging the local villages. I can't imagine just how surreal it must have been to be living in this jungle as your family members were flying overhead, yelling at you to come home over loudspeakers. The Blutfahne. The blood flag was a revered object of the German Nazi Party. It was a flag that was carried during the Beer Hall Putsch in 1923. An SA man, part of the paramilitary arm of the party at that moment in history, was marching alongside the flag when he was fatally wounded by the Munich police and stained the flag with his blood. The flag was displayed prominently in many ceremonies throughout World War II before disappearing into obscurity. It's unknown that the flag is even intact at this point. Fugo balloon bomb. I know that balloons haven't been in the public eye at any point in recent memory, but balloons attacking the American homeland has been a thing in the past. Project Fugo was a Japanese ordnance program in which 9,300 balloons were launched at the mainland US. They were intended to cause forest fires and wreak havoc and terror among the American populace. Japan had an extremely limited ability to strike the lower 48, so 70-foot tall balloons containing a paper canopy and equipped with an anti-personnel mine and 2 incendiary devices were developed. The initial plan was to launch 200 balloons from submarines 600 miles from the western coast, but due to an American assault in Guadalcanal, the submarines were recalled for the operations in that area of the Pacific. As a result, the operation to launch them from the Japanese home islands was approved, and the attacks commenced between November 1944 and April 1945. The bombs were ineffective, causing 6 deaths, a pair of small brush fires, and a temporary loss of power in a military site in Washington state. These balloons are widely considered to be the first intercontinental weapon. Big Stoop Plane. The Big Stoop was a B-24 bomber containing a crew of 11 people that went missing in the South Pacific in September 1944. The whereabouts of the crew remained unknown up until it was discovered by one of the sons of the crew members in 2014. 3,000 lost Chinese soldiers. In December 1937, a battalion of 3,000 Chinese soldiers had been stationed in a 2-mile stretch of land around the city of Nanjing. The Japanese were in the process of committing a series of atrocities in the city, and the Chinese had been dispatched to prevent their forces from breaking out of the city. On the evening of December 9th, the commander of the Chinese battalion went to bed as normal. He had ensured that his troops were dug in and that sentries were posted to watch the Japanese positions. The next morning, he woke to bad news from his aide. The defensive line had failed to respond. The commander sent a team to investigate, and they found the trenches completely empty. There were no signs of a struggle. The fires that had been set up in the trenches were still warm. The machine guns were in place and had not been used or fired. All of the officers and enlisted men had disappeared. The men in the nearby positions near a bridge leading into the city were questioned, but they said they had seen no movement in the trenches nearby, and that they had heard no sounds of combat or of the men retreating. The bridge overlooked a body of water that surrounded this edge of the city, and the primary way of accessing it was through the bridge. This meant that the idea that they had crossed and surrendered to the Japanese was unlikely. Desertion was slightly more likely, but the logistics to move close to 3,000 troops out of their positions and into the nearby villages without being discovered by government forces would have been very difficult. The Japanese had no reports of encountering this particular battalion, so the disappearance of this battalion remains inexplicable. Luck of Kokura. On the morning of August 9th, 1945, the bomber containing one of the atomic bombs was sent to attack the city of Kokura. When it arrived near the city, they found the target obscured by low cloud cover. As a result, the crew went on to drop the bomb on their secondary target, the city of Nagasaki. A phrase emerged after this event in Japan, referring to Kokura's luck, or the luck of Kokura. Dirlwanger Brigade. The 36th Grenadier Division The Waffen-SS was a unit of criminals. Named the Dirlwanger Brigade after its commander, the group was made out of former poachers, German deserters, prisoners, even men who had been taken out of concentration camps. Dirlwanger was a World War I vet who had been imprisoned for a variety of crimes that should have put him behind bars for life. One of his buddies in the SS got him out of jail and gave him command of a special unit. Poachers were initially conducted into the 36th Division to help the German occupying forces in France to assist in the capture of partisans. The thought was that professional hunters could use their skills to locate and track down troublesome rebel groups. The group was effective, was later sent to Poland in 1942. The 36th Division gained infamy during its time in Poland, in which multiple war crimes were attributed to Dirlwanger and the members of his outfit. The unit experienced conflict with the advancing Red Army, and Dirlwanger was shot in the chest, thrown in prison, and beaten to the point of death by his Polish guards. Tier 4. Rommel's Gold. This cache was composed of hundreds of gold ingots, was first reported during Rommel's campaigns in Yugoslavia and the Balkans. After pushing Tito out of Belgrade, Rommel's forces discovered a massive cache of gold. Its whereabouts remain unknown, but many hypothesize that it was hidden somewhere in the African desert by his tank brigades, but others believe it to be located somewhere in eastern Germany. Sikorsky's death. I'm not going to attempt to try this man's first name. Sikorsky was a statesman who led Poland's government in exile in the opening years of the Second World War. He was disliked by Stalin and died in an airplane incident over Gibraltar in July of 1943. Many suspect that Russian espionage was the reason for his death in the crash. No picnic on Mount Kenya. This entry refers to a 1946 book by that name that recounts the story of 3 Italian POWs during the war. After reading about it, it's definitely on my reading list. In 1943, in a camp called POW Camp 354, located near Mount Kenya, in Kenya, 3 men broke out and escaped the area. The men had improvised climbing gear, limited rations that they had stolen from the cafeteria, and a rough map from a tin of OXO they had been given. The author, a sailor, and a former doctor set out throughout the wilderness to cross the mountain and travel north towards Ethiopia, where they hoped to link up with Axis forces. By the time they reached the base of the mountain, the sailor was becoming ill, and he decided to go back rather than deal with both extreme heights and illness. The author and the doctor made it some 15,000 feet up the face of the mountain before their rations ran out and their gear began to become dangerously worn. In the end, they returned and broke back into the camp, to the surprise of the British, and gave themselves up. Pearl Harbor Ghost Plane. Supposedly, on December 8, 1942, on the 1-year anniversary of the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, radars on the west coast and in Hawaii picked up an unusual radar reading emanating from Japan. The sky was overcast and unsuitable for an aerial attack. A pair of pilots were dispatched to go check out the strange reading. They radioed the ground to report that the plane was a P-40, and it bore older markings that hadn't been seen on planes in the Pacific for months. They pulled up closer and found the plane heavily ridden with bullet holes and possessing no landing gear. They were confused as to how this plane could even maintain speed. Then one of the pilots noticed the pilot of this craft. His head was lolled to the side. His flight suit was stained with blood. The dying pilot waved. Then his plane tipped and crashed into an island. People were sent out to examine the wreckage, but none was ever found at the crash site. Ghost Army. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was an Allied outfit dedicated to fooling the Axis. Employing fake radio chatter, inflatable decoy military equipment, and loudspeakers that generated engine noises and other sound effects, the Ghost Army could make itself seem 30 times its size to nearby Axis units. In the European campaign, the Ghost Army performed 20 missions of deception on the front lines. Commanded by a fashion designer, the unit included artists, admin, actors, sound designers, and architects. The average unit IQ was 119, making it one of the greatest brain trusts in the US Army. One of its more famous operations was at the French port of Brest, deploying 50 dummy tanks, fake artillery emplacements, and sound trucks just a few hundred yards from the German lines. This helped the Germans to miss that Patton's Third Army had passed their lines and was beginning to move freely through eastern France. There's a lot of interesting stories surrounding this, so if you're interested, there are resources and books out there about the 23rd. This unit's contributions were considered important enough that the unit earned a Congressional Medal. The ingenuity of this unit was pretty impressive. They were able to imitate an army of 40,000 troops using 600 dummy tanks and sound equipment. Their tuning was good enough that they could imitate officers yelling at men to put out their cigarettes, among a variety of other noises you'd associate with an Allied army amassing in a camp. They also helped build fake tank artillery emplacements in Normandy, drawing enemy fire from friendly troops and the men landing on the beach the first days of the liberation of Europe. Ghost Blimp. It was the early morning hours of August 16, 1942. A U.S. Navy blimp sent out over the San Francisco Bay on a routine submarine search mission. 5 hours later, the blimp, named the L-8, crashed in a suburban city street in Daly City, California. Firefighters quickly set out to put out the fire, but when they went to the flaming structure to rescue the pilots, no one was found. Both of the pilots were experienced U.S. Navy officers, were known for their work on other airships. The last transmission from the crew was shortly after they set out. They radioed that they had spotted an oil slick in the water, were investigating to see if an enemy submarine was in the area. After that, there was complete radio silence. The Navy deployed search planes soon after that, but those were brought back into their berths after it was falsely reported that the crew had landed back at their airbase. Back at the site, the police and fire department found the interior of the blimp relatively unharmed, outside of some mild fire damage. The ship's radio was in working order, and the emergency parachutes had been left untouched. A single anti-sub depth charge was missing, along with the men's inflatable Mae West life jackets, which was most likely because the men were wearing them at the time. The sea near the blimp's flight path had been pretty busy that day. Observers saw it drop a pair of flares over the oil slick and then ascend above the clouds. Another seaplane spotted it at a lower height at around 2,000 feet later on. Despite these sightings, the whereabouts of the crew is still unknown. Liberty Steaks. During the war, hamburgers were considered to sound too German, so many were rebranded as Liberty Steaks. Joseph Mengele Twins. I'm going to try to keep this PG, but the events surrounding this man are some of the more haunting things I've read about in World War II. I first encountered this story in a memoir by the Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel. Joseph Mengele was a German doctor who ran a program that involved thousands of pairs of twins. He preferred to take young pairs from their families when they were taken to concentration camps. Mengele used one of the pairs he collected as a test subject and left the other untouched as a control. He subjected them to everything from dissections to infections with diseases to forced amputations, along with many other horrendous experiments. The Nazis were interested in eugenics, and this program sought to prove that breeding was the cause of mental diseases and physical conditions. Unfortunately, in the end, Joseph Mengele was able to escape to South America after the war, passing away in 1979. Aleutian Islands Campaign. This conflict was one of the handful to happen on US soil. These battles took place when US and Canadian forces spent the months between June 1942 and August 1943 pushing Japanese soldiers out of their garrisons and the islands. The seizing of American soil by the Japanese sparked national anger in America, but the Allied war planners mostly ignored the garrisons, as they had much wider strategic concerns. Later on, Operation Hand Crab, was launched to retake the islands. 11,000 Allied troops encountered fierce resistance during their initial landing in the Battle of Attu. After this, the American military achieved sea and air dominance over the islands, starving out the enemy troops. The battle, referred to as the Battle of Attu, was the only land battle fought in American soil during World War II. Interestingly, the Chinese spy balloon that arrived in the US in February 2023 loosely followed the planned Japanese invasion path across the Aleutians. Cargo cults. This is one of the cooler entries on the iceberg, at least in my opinion. The cargo cults were first observed in 1946 by patrols of the Australian Commonwealth in the highlands of New Guinea. The native men in the villages they encountered butchered all their livestock and expressed that they were sacrificing their animals in preparation of the arrival of the great pigs. The villagers claimed that in 3 days' time, the great pigs would arrive in the sky. The core beliefs of this religious system was that by engaging in religious practices, these tribes would be able to receive modern gifts from more technologically advanced cultures, stuff like Coca-Cola or electronic equipment. This has its roots in World War II, in which villagers saw thousands of American and Japanese soldiers enter their lands, and saw the mass-produced rations and radios and other equipment. The sheer technological might they were witnessing in action made many think that the goods they were uncovering were divine. The war ended, and the endless flow of disposed goods from the GIs subsided. The villagers set up imitations of airstrips in military offices, hoping the goods would come again. Today, the religion exists as the John Frum and Tom Navy movements. On February 15th, in an unknown year in the future, believers think that John Frum, their name for the average American Marine infantryman, or Tom Navy, their image of the US naval officers seen during the war, will return with goods in modern tech. These celebrations include men with USA painted on their bare chests, drilling with sticks of wood, while under a pole that flies an American flag. Panzerschokolade. This refers to German tank chocolate. Tank chocolate is a falsified image of meth-laced chocolate that circulated around the internet for many years. It's confirmed false, as the company listed wasn't founded for over 40 years after World War II. In the place where it was supposedly made, the Hermann Göring chocolate factory, never existed. The closest equivalent would be Coca-Cola, a chocolate issued to Luftwaffe pilots to combat exhaustion during missions. This contained caffeine instead of meth. But hey, there's always an outside chance that this was tested at some point in the 30s. Project Habakkuk. Okay, I've enjoyed the last few entries immensely. This was a British special weapons project first floated by a British inventor named Geoffrey Pike. Pike's idea was a 1-mile-long aircraft carrier, including a hull made out of solid ice. The blueprints had a long landing strip on the top of its surface, and a series of hollow interior pieces that could shelter massive amounts of aircraft and other services. It was to be the largest machine ever built on land or water. The Berg ship was unsinkable due to the fact that ice floats. The only issue was that the ice needed to be preserved to make the ship feasible. Pykrete was the answer to this problem, It was a mix of ice and wood pulp, granting greater strength to the ice, and could be worked with like wood, while possessing construction similar to steel rebar. The ship still needed a system of refrigerators to keep it in the same state. Pykrete was created by a molecular biologist named Max Perutz, who would later win a Nobel Prize, and a block was given to Churchill while he was in the bathtub. Churchill was impressed. He helped with the development of the tank and had ideas for insane superweapons like land ships in the past, so he approved of the program. The project earned the name Habakkuk from a Bible verse from the book of the same name. Behold ye among the nations, and wonder marvelously, for I am working a work in your days, which ye will not believe, though it be told to you. Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 5. A prototype was made on Patricia Lake in Canada in 1943, and it measured around 1,000 tons. It functioned well, able to keep cool in the summer with a single, small motor. A full-size model was ordered afterwards, the one measuring a mile long. Unfortunately, the price of £10 million was too high, and aircraft carriers were needed less and less in the European theater. It took 3 whole summers for the Patricia Lake prototype to melt by itself. The Quebocois Rambo. Leo Major was a Canadian trooper who single-handedly liberated an entire Dutch city. The oldest of 13 children, he enlisted in the Canadian Army in 1940 and worked as a sniper, quickly proving he was destined to become the real-world equivalent of the TF-2 sniper. In 1944, he participated in the opening of D-Day, working as a sniper with his unit. Major lost one of his eyes to a German grenade during the opening days of the Allied invasion of Normandy, and had broken his arm, 2 vertebrae, and both of his ankles when his truck was launched 50 feet into the air by an enemy landmine. Another instance of this man's insane heroism was during the Battle of Scheldt in the Netherlands. Major left his unit to swim through the canals outside the city, killing 2 German soldiers outside of an army camp. He then ambushed the commanding officer of the camp while he was sleeping, and forced 93 German soldiers to surrender. Another insane story was when he entered a Dutch town called Zwolle. He and a friend sneaked into the German-occupied town, and his friend was gunned down by enemy soldiers. Major gunned down the soldiers, then walked into the officer quarters, persuaded one of the senior officers that he was surrounded by Canadian forces. He told them to leave immediately or face capture. Majors then charged through the town to simulate an attack and enlisted the Dutch resistance to help capture over 50 German soldiers. Majors won multiple awards and gained recognition for his acts in the Korean War as well. Despite his heroism, he lived a quiet life without the recognition he deserved. Fortunately, a biography and documentary of his life are due to come out soon. Pete Ellis predictions. Pete Ellis was a Marine strategist who foresaw a war between America and the Japanese Empire, a statement he made in 1921. Ellis advocated for amphibious warfare, and his papers and documents foresaw pretty much exactly how the War in the Pacific would go down. He passed away in 1923, but his plans for war proved useful for military planners 20 years after he published his work in 1921. Nazi Wood Base. This probably refers to Mandel Airfield, a German military base whose runway was constructed out of wood. They made a magazine there, I guess you could call it the Mandel Catalog. It was in operation for most of the war. Camp Siegfried. Camp Siegfried was a summer camp for the Hitler Youth, based out of Yaphank, New York State. Willie Harold. Harold was a deserter from the Wehrmacht who left his airborne unit and then stumbled upon a shot-up car belonging to a dead Luftwaffe captain. He stole the officer's uniform and went on an adventure which he put together a group of men that he had taken command of from other units by claiming he was on a special mission for the Führer. He engaged in a personal war against the Allies, was informed that he could shore up his unit by using the residents of a camp that contained deserters. Harold went there and eventually took over the camp, and he ended up shooting many of the escaping deserters and became an executioner for the government. In the midst of all this chaos, Harold was able to conceal his identity as a deserter. He was later brought to trial and executed by the British for his war crimes. Dissolving Nobel Prizes. Niels Bohr was a renowned chemist who had only hours to destroy 2 Nobel Prize medals before the invading German armies reached his location in Copenhagen. The medals were made of 23-karat gold, and the Nazis wanted any gold they could find. 2 Jewish Nobel laureates sent their medals to Bohr to dissolve before they could be taken from them. The chemist used a mix called aqua regia, a mixture of 3 parts hydrochloric acid and 1 part nitric acid. The process was excruciatingly slow, but by the time the Germans showed up, all that remained of the prizes was 2 vials of a colorless solution that was stowed on a shelf in the laboratory. Fortunately, one of the medals was recast in 1950, and the other in 1952, and reissued to the 2 men. Edward Bloch. Bloch was a Jewish physician, born in 1872. He was a former veteran of the Austrian army who gained a reputation as an excellent doctor for those he served in his community. One of the people he regularly visited was the Hitler family, as Adolf's mother was dying from cancer, was unable to save her in the end. Hitler had a long correspondence with Bloch, as the doctor treated his mother as she lay dying from cancer. In 1938, Bloch had to close his medical practice after the annexation of Austria, and after all his patients left. He wrote Hitler for help, and the dictator assigned a Gestapo unit to protect the doctor and let him live in peace, until the doctor asked if he could emigrate to New York City to see his daughter. The Führer allowed this, and Bloch lived out his life in the US until his death from stomach cancer in 1945. Hitler said, "If all Jews were like him, there would be no Jewish question." Black Book. The Black Book was a list called Special Search List, Great Britain. It was made by the SS in preparation for the invasion of Britain. It contained the names of many who were considered prominent or dangerous enough to be arrested by the regime. The list was 144 pages long, contained 2,820 names of politicians, writers, figures in the British intelligence community, artists, and scientists. Fortunately, the list was almost never used, except for when the Germans occupied the Channel Islands and rounded up the people on the list who dwelt there. Interesting side note, after the war, it was considered like a badge to have your name on that list when it was discovered. Tier 5. Panfilov's 28 Guardsmen. This was a Soviet legend in which 28 men, commanded by an officer named Pamfilov, made a heroic last stand to slow down the German advance on Moscow in the winter of 1941. The men destroyed 18 enemy tanks, and it was said that an officer named Klotchkov yelled, "There is nowhere to retreat! Moscow is behind us!" before charging an enemy tank with an armful of grenades. The story had supposedly been told by the last man of the unit, who, while suffering from his wounds in the hospital, recounted the story and then passed away. It became a massive source of national pride, was later found to contain a variety of inconsistencies, and then was found to be completely false. This sentence sums up Stalin's regime. 2 of the men were still alive, and many of the details were reproved in an internal memo in 1948. Whatever you think, the story left a tangible mark on the USSR's propaganda for many years afterwards. Raoul Wallenberg disappearance. Wallenberg was a Swedish architect and diplomat who single-handedly saved the lives of many Jewish refugees. The Swedes sent Wallenberg to the city of Budapest to protect the lives of 200,000 Jewish citizens who lived in the capital. Wallenberg was busy, using a variety of methods ranging from issuing documents to establishing a safe zone to securing the release of prisoners from trains going to concentration camps. He was last seen to have been detained by the Soviets on January 17, 1945. Since then, no records of his detention or fate have been found in any declassified archives, but the government said in a statement from 2000 that he died in a prison in 1947. He gained recognition for his efforts to save the Jews from the Hungarian Jewish Council and was given honorary citizenship in the US. Philadelphia Experiment. This was an alleged experiment that occurred on October 28, 1943. USS Eldridge, a destroyer, was said to have been undergoing trials in which devices designed to refract radar transmissions were fitted to the vessel. This would make it very stealthy. Witnesses supposedly saw a blue-green glow hover around the ship's hull as it disappeared from Norfolk and reappeared in Philadelphia. Apparently, the ship went into the immaterium, as stories recounted that the crew went insane or literally fused with the vessel. This was later revealed to be a hoax. The Navy released a report saying that the ship had been covered in a phenomenon known as St. Elmo's Fire and had made headway from Norfolk to Philadelphia in a span of 2 hours. Pippo Airplane. Pippo was a popular tale told by civilians in northern Italy who were stuck between the Allied and Axis forces after Italy capitulated. It was said that a singular unidentified airplane would fly over this area of Italy and bomb, strafe the landscape, or engage in recon. It was nicknamed Pippo. Historians believe that it was a de Havilland mosquito. Lost Portrait of a Young Man. This was a painting produced by the artist Raphael in 1513. It was found in a hideaway in Poland by German troops. It was last seen in the residence of Hans Frank, the leader of occupied Poland when it was ruled by the Nazis. He was like a puppet guy. Other paintings by Renaissance artists were located in Frank's home, but the whereabouts of this portrait remain shrouded. Hey everyone, so I just finished editing, and I realized I said this guy's name in the following entry completely incorrect, so please forgive me. It's not pronounced Goring, it's pronounced Goering, so heads up, sorry about that. Hermann Cyanide. Hermann Goring, the second highest ranking German official to be sentenced at the Nuremberg trials, and by far the heaviest, took a pill right before his death sentence was enacted. Despite the Allied guards placed near him over the past year, in 1946, he was able to somehow get access to a cyanide pill. Himmler had cracked down on a capsule in a false tooth in 1945 and taken himself out, so guards were diligent in their examinations of Goring. A guard named Herbert Stivers claimed to have issued the capsule to the former Reichsmarshal, something he admitted to years after the event. Stivers claimed that a local girl he was interested in asked him to give, quote-unquote, medicine to the prisoner, and Stivers accepted the task without being aware of what he was transporting. Sun Gun. You might have heard of this weapon from pieces of media like Wolfenstein. The German plans called for a concave disc, roughly a mile in diameter, that would use the power of the sun to destroy enemy cities. A scientist named Hermann Oberth was accredited with the concept of making something that could set down such a blood-red light. When he thought of that concept in 1923, he intended it to bring sunlight to thaw cold locations and provide illumination in others. He and other German scientists saw the usefulness of this concept as a weapon of mass destruction. No schematics survive for the process of sending the mirror into space, but it was thought that a small crew could live in a complex anchored in the mirror. The crew would be equipped with helmets and magnetized boots, and would be kept alive by the oxygen produced by a garden of thousands of plants. Oberth tried to sell the idea to many countries after the war, with limited success. Toru Nakamura. Onada, the other Japanese holdout who was earlier in the Iceberg, was actually not the last holdout. This man was. Nakamura surrendered on December 18th, 1974, 10 months after Onada. He had refused to surrender, even after pamphlets were dropped announcing the war was over in 1945, as he believed this to be lies concocted by the enemy. Nakamura spent the next 30 years living off the land, hunting, fishing, and collecting fruit. He believed the war was still going on for many more years, as he witnessed a constant stream of increasingly advanced aircraft go over the island he was on. He later told interviewers that he assumed this meant an arms race was happening between the Allies and the Axis, and that the war was still going on. These flights were in fact Indonesian aircraft going over his position. He later surrendered after searchers waved a Japanese flag and played the Japanese national anthem. He came out of the jungle naked, was given a clean bill of health by Indonesian authorities. Nakamura was later reunited with his family in Taiwan. His return reads like something out of a Greek myth. His parents were dead, his wife had remarried. He later passed away from lung cancer in 1979. Alpine Fortress Gold. In 1943, as previously mentioned, the Italian government capitulated. While the Allied forces advanced, the Germans moved 119 tons of gold out of the Bank of Italy and withdrew towards their fortifications in the north. The Allies spent time after the armistice looking for the lost gold. They mostly succeeded, finding almost all of the gold and returning it to Italy. By the end of the search, 24 tons were still missing. A shipment was last seen in the town of Fortezza, and it is believed that the gold is buried under the fortress near the town. The fortress is currently the home of an Alpine brigade of soldiers, so the government there has said there is no rush to excavate the site and recover the gold if it is still there. Who ordered the attack on Project Jericho? This is probably referring to Operation Jericho, a raid conducted by mosquito bombers in France. A squadron of these light bombers were deployed to knock down a wall and free members of the French resistance being held in a prison. The raid was a success, as mosquito aircraft, flying at a low height, were able to take out the wall and destroy a guardhouse, although a few prisoners were killed by the attack. The assault was initially called off a few hours before the operation window due to cloud cover, but someone ordered the attack, despite the weather. There's some confusion over who exactly led the attack, but it's most likely a man named Wing Commander Black Smith. Marcel Petiot. Petiot was a French serial killer who used the events of the war to profit off the Jews. Using the people who were trying to escape France after it fell to the Germans, Petiot poisoned his victims, took their valuables, and placed the bodies in his basement. He was arrested after the liberation of France, and the bodies of 26 people were discovered. He claimed that they were Nazis, but the evidence mounted. He was guillotined. Project Re's purpose. As the tide began to turn, Nazi war planners initiated the construction of an underground city, a place where they could operate without the interruption of enemy air assaults. 18 months later, the Russians discovered a series of half-completed structures left in disrepair. Re's is the German synonym of giant, and its name reflected the aim of the inventors of the plan. 7 underground structures would be united by tunnels stretching for 5.5 miles beneath the Owl Mountains. An estimated 2.2 million cubic feet of rock would have to be cleared, and when the ruins were found abandoned, only half that amount had been removed. Albert Speer, the architect of the Third Reich, intended the site to be a place where the High Command could continue to function amidst the attacks of the Allies. Others have postulated that this was a great location for conducting secret weapons tests. The structure could harbor nuclear testing ranges, production facilities for rockets, along with supposed anti-gravity research. There was also the alleged Die Glock, a 12-foot-high cylinder that's purpose remains mysterious. Land Cruiser. The Land Cruiser P-1000 Rat was a super tank planned to be 115 feet long and weighing at around 1,000 tons. This tank would have had a turret equipped with twin 280mm cannons taken off of a battleship, along with emplacements of anti-aircraft and smaller arms. It would be manned by a 40-person crew and had a vehicle bay large enough to hold a fleet of accompanying motorcycles for recon. It had 69-foot-long treads and 300 tons of armor, 10 inches thick, covering its exterior. Designed by Krupp, the producer of the Tiger, it was designated as a wonder weapon. It would be unable to be loaded onto trains and would be too large to cross any bridge it encountered. After a year of development, the project was cancelled after being found to be impractical. Operation Wikinger. This was a sortie conducted by the German Navy that took place in the North Sea. Unfortunately for the men of the Navy and the Air Service, inter-service communication had not been set up, so 2 German ships were lost to Luftwaffe bombers. Bat Bomb. Project X-Ray was an attempt by the US to weaponize bats. The plan was to attach thimble-sized firebombs to these creatures, load them into warheads, drop the warheads over Japanese cities, which would then lose their shielding, and allow the bats to fly free, to roost. These bats would nest in the rafters of Japanese homes, would explode after the timer went off. Sergei Oleshkov. Oleshkov was born in 1936 in a little village in the Kaluga region of the USSR. Oleshkov's mother was killed trying to protect him, and his 10-year-old brother was killed by the German forces in the occupied village. A villager helped the little boy escape, and he went into the woods and moved towards the city of Kozulski. He was found by Soviet forces, exhausted and covered in healed-over scabs and bug bites. The soldiers were shocked after learning about the death of his family and the actions the Nazis were taking against partisans. The boy was immediately given medical assistance, a suitable uniform, and then made a pupil under the 142nd Guards Infantry Division. The commander of the unit, Major Vorobiev, cared for him and then officially adopted him. Sergei later told his adopted dad that he thought a local nurse, Nina Bedova, would make a great adoptive parent. The major considered this and married the nurse, and the 3 officially registered as a family after the Battle of Stalingrad. Sergei served as an assistant, helping with various assignments behind the front lines. He carried messages to other units and supplied troops with water and ammunition. One time, Sergei was delivering messages when he spotted a group of men concealed in a haystack. He told the commander of the nearby unit, and the men in the haystack were found to be German artillery spotters. Later on, the command tent of his adopted dad was destroyed, and Sergei helped call out that the major was still under the rubble. The commander would have died if not for the boy's intervention. I forgot to mention, but Sergei was about 6 at the time that these events occurred. Sergei was given a medal and issued a Walter P-38. 142nd Guard Regiment was later deployed to Stalingrad, and the boy was injured by mortar fire. He recovered, and the battle concluded soon after. Sergei's hometown was liberated, and the story of how he was found was confirmed by the surviving residents of the village. He learned that his older brothers, Ivan and Andrew, were alive and stationed in the front of the Russian advance. This little family survived the war and later settled back in the USSR. Sergei was given a medal after victory against Germany was achieved and lived a quiet life as a legal advisor at a factory. He married and lived to see his grandchildren, later passing away in 1990 due to health complications from his early life. Nieves Fernandez. This image is of Fernandez showing a GI how she took out her opponents using a combat knife. Fernandez is the only known female Filipino guerrilla leader, was a school teacher before the Japanese occupation of the Leyte Islands. She led a group of 110 men against the occupiers, and the group was credited with 200 kills of enemy combatants, using knives and makeshift shotguns constructed from lengths of pipe. She was considered dangerous, with a reward of 10,000 pesos placed on her head. Fernandez used bolo knives to sever the carotid artery and jugular in the neck, a method that would also send the victim into unconsciousness and force them to suck in air, preventing them from crying out. Search for the Holy Grail. The concept of Nazis searching for hidden relics is popular in media and films, and I briefly covered that in my Gates to Hell video. In fact, this film idea holds true, as Himmler and many other German commanders were deeply interested in the spiritual realms. Himmler actually was part of a 1940 mission to search for the Holy Grail in Montserrat, in the region of Catalonia. The Holy Grail was said to be located there in German legend, poetry, and even opera. It was not a success, and the Germans moved on to other searches after it was not found there. Masanobu Tsuji disappearance. The story of this man is fairly convoluted, but I will sum it up as best as I can. Tsuji served as an officer in the Japanese army and racked up multiple war crimes, including eating an enemy combatant. He escaped to Indochina and later helped the Viet Cong during the later half of their war against the French. He went missing during the opening stages of the Vietnam War, and his fate remains unknown. Tier 6. Lebensborn. This was a state-sponsored initiative to extend the opportunity to Aryan women to birth the child in secret. Both parents would need to meet a purity test, and then relationships between any two individuals were permitted. Most of the mothers were unmarried girls. After the birth, the baby would be taken and cared for in a Lebensborn nursery, which was furnished with the nicest furniture, much of which was appropriated from Jewish homes that had been ransacked. The program was later expanded to include any mothers, and many children from one-off relationships were born in these homes. In an even creepier turn of events, 100,000 young children from the occupied territories were taken to these centers and indoctrinated. They were made to forget their parents, were beaten if they refused to become part of the plan for Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. Those not deemed worthy were sent to concentration camps. The overall aim of the program was to raise new Aryan leaders to guide Germany into a new age. MI6 Occult Combat. There's an entirely strange aspect to the intelligence side of British warfare in World War II. Some examples include Operation Mistletoe and the Psychological Warfare Executive. Operation Mistletoe is an unconfirmed operation that took place in a forest in Sussex. The aim of the program was to convince Germany's more superstitious elements that the Allies were conducting an occult war against them. Allegedly, a group of Canadian soldiers pretended to be wizards, emblazoned with hexagrams, and participated in a mock ceremony involving a doll of Hitler and a strange mirror. On the other hand, the psychological warfare executive conducted multiple operations in which the occultist Aleister Crowley kept in touch with Axis occultists and fed them false intel. There's apparently even more connections between intel and the occult, but the sources were scant when it came to this entry. 364th Regiment. This was an all-black unit of soldiers, most of whom were recruited from Chicago, New York City, and Philadelphia. As was typical at the time, white officers were placed in command, and they treated their troops with prejudice. The men wrote letters to their congressmen and senators, but these were intercepted by the officers and used to indict them, the enlisted men, of troublemaking. An organization formed, called the Double V, to protest the injustices happening throughout the branches, and they took up the cause of helping these men. The unit was involved in the Phoenix Thanksgiving riot, and they were relocated to Van Dorn, Mississippi. They were not given equal treatment, and many were placed in the camp stockade. One soldier, named Francis Johnson, was given confinement and only bread and water for protesting when a commanding officer repeatedly kicked him. Another soldier got in a fight with white MPs, military police, when they attempted to arrest him over a missing button on his uniform. The local sheriff shot the soldier after he fought the MPs, causing a riot to occur, in which the black soldiers picked up their weapons and ammunition to defend themselves, and a firefight happened between them and a black MP squad sent to stop them. The thought was that the black MP squad would maybe get them to stop shooting. The rest of the details were expunged, but after that day, the unit was broken up, and many of the surviving soldiers were sent to distant outposts in the Aleutians. Many have suggested that an incident took place, in which many soldiers were captured, lined up, and taken out by white officers and even civilians. The Army has denied this, despite the missing records for that day, May 30th, 1943, and the removal of names on the regimental lists in the subsequent weeks. Coco Chanel was a spy. Chanel was a French fashion designer who was, in fact, a German spy. Her handle was Agent F-7124, and she engaged in romances with German aristocrats and commanders within the party. She helped with the intelligence for a scrapped plan to take over the Spanish government in 1941, and intended to broker a deal between the Nazis and the British early on in the war. She was later captured after France was liberated in 1944. Chanel was later freed, and many believe her involvement with the Third Reich was more a relationship of convenience rather than actual political belief. Nazi South America Plan. Allegedly, a map of German conquest agendas in South America was made in 1941 after the success of their campaigns in Europe and North Africa. The game plan was to split the continent into 4 Axis-controlled colonies, as shown by this map. I couldn't find much information on other details of the plan to dominate the continent, but it's an interesting artifact from when the Axis appeared to be unstoppable. Erich Jan Hanussen Prediction. In the pages of a 1932 issue of a Berlin magazine, published by Hanussen, a man known for being clairvoyant, the publicist predicted that Hitler and his party were destined for greatness. For the most part, the government at the time disliked the occult, but the Nazis used it to their advantage when they could. However, Hanussen was Jewish, so despite his predictions that favored them, the brown shirts later assassinated the occultist. Gertrude Silver disappearance. Gertrude Silver was a WASP, or Women Air Force Service pilot, who had been trained on multiple different types of American military aircraft. Silver, along with 39 other WASPs, were sent on a mission to ferry a flight of P-51 Mustangs from California to New Jersey. The trip took 4 days, and when the fleet arrived, they realized that Silver was missing. It was determined she never made the first stop over, which was in Nevada, so crews spent 30 days searching for the remains of her plane throughout California. Mechanical issues and sabotage are some of the most popular theories surrounding her disappearance. Many of the women in the flight reported experiencing cockpit hatch issues, making it likely that Silver could have been unable to bail out. In addition, some of the members of the male group serving alongside the WASPs were known to often screw around with the aircraft, leaving rags in the engine wells and even slashing tires. This may have led to her demise. Curse of Timur. Timur, often called Tamerlane in the West, was a warlord who ruled over a large portion of Asia in the 1300s. Despite the massive civilian casualties he caused, Tamerlane was well respected for his tactical prowess and support of the arts. Stalin sent a team of archaeologists to open Tamerlane's tomb, which was located in Uzbekistan, which greatly upset the villagers and Muslim clergy who lived in the village near the tomb. It was said that when the team opened the coffin and removed Tamerlane's corpse, they found the following message on the back of the coffin: "Whoever opens my tomb shall unleash an invader more terrible than I." In a few short hours, the German invasion of Russia began. In 1942, Stalin ordered the remains be reinterred with full ceremony. A few days later, the Germans surrendered in Stalingrad. Perhaps it's a coincidence, perhaps not. Piper Bill. This entry refers to a young Scottish piper who played the bagpipes as his unit entered combat on Sword Beach during D-Day, skirting enemy fire, wearing a kilt, and only armed with a ceremonial dirk. Bill Moulin played the bagpipes as the Allied forces fought their way up the beach. Captured German troops stated that they avoided firing on him as they believed he had fully lost his mind. Mad Jack. This man has had videos made on him. Mad Jack was a British commando who was well known for fighting battles equipped with a sword and bow and arrow. He got confirmed kills on enemy combatants with both weapons. Mad Lil Clown. This was one of the first initial meetings between Hitler and Mussolini. The two of them did not have a good initial conversation. The subject was Hitler's planned annexation of Austria. Hitler wanted Austria to rejoin the new Third Reich, while Mussolini wanted Austria to remain a sovereign country. The Führer began to yell, and after a shouting match, Mussolini left the conference room. The only thing he said to his aides about the meeting and Hitler was, "A mad little clown." White Rose. This entry refers to an idealist movement that went by. This small group of German citizens denounced the actions of the Nazis, as the leader, Hans Scholl, was made aware of the atrocities conducted by the Germans. This group of students distributed pamphlets that read, "We will not be silent. We are your conscience. The White Rose will not leave you in peace." They were aware that only military domination can end the regime, so the group limited their objectives to cause a renewal of the German spirit from within. After the loss of Stalingrad, the students secretly posted their messages throughout the city of Munich by night, but a university janitor saw them and reported their identities to the Gestapo. The group, along with a philosophy professor named Kurt Huber, were arrested and executed in early 1943. Mexikoplatz. This Art Deco structure was constructed by Austria and named the Mexikoplatz, as Mexico was one of the few countries to speak up against the annexation of Austria by the Germans. Thiaroye Massacre. The Thiaroye Massacre was a 1944 event in which French West African troops were killed by the other French forces fighting alongside them. The government claimed that it was a mutiny, but later research proved this false. In fact, the West Africans had been taken out because they had demanded their wages that they had earned after years of war. Positive Christianity. This was a school of thought that was pioneered by the thinker Alfred Rosenberg. It saw Jesus not as Jewish but more as an Aryan overlord, and said the Jews had nothing to do with the salvation of humanity. The idea had existed before the election of the Führer, but Rosenberg quickly adapted his ideas to the new regime. Initially, the ideas were intentionally vague, a fact that caused Hitler to complain about Rosenberg, but some parts of Positive Christianity soon called for removal of names like Protestant or Catholic, and more emphasis on Nordic tales. He wanted the images of the heroic gods of the Norse to be reflected in Christianity, and for the faith to be anti-Semitic, citing Jesus' arguments with the Pharisees and Jewish leaders. This completely went over the fact that Christ said, I've not come to abolish the law but to fulfill it. This is something that goes directly against that statement. The practice of combining Norse myth with Christian beliefs without the narrative of the Old Testament was adopted as part of the Nazi doctrine. Overall, this idea was not prevalent, as many Germans continued to follow their respective faiths, instead of following the idea of the Reich Church. Sankt Georgen Andergusen Secret Base. This base was constructed using the forced labor of concentration camp inmates. The site was one of the worst in Germany, with an average mortality rate of 98% among the concentration camp inmates. A complex for producing secret weapons was built deep underground and was given the moniker Berg Crystal, began operation in 1944. 450 jet plane fuselages were produced up until the end of the war, and engines and other parts were transported by rail car by night, traveling from the cave system to other factories in Germany and Bohemia. The existence of the base was made top secret, and the pilots had no clue as to where the planes were produced. Many of the tunnels were demolished after the war, but parts of the complex still remain open to public viewing today. Tier 7. Haunebu Nazi aircraft. These didn't truly become as popular as they would after the war, but the traditional image of an alien spacecraft has its roots in a weapons program. The first blueprints were produced when a German engineer saw a test flight of a Focke-Wulf FW-61, a progenitor of the helicopter, and desired to place the rotors in the airframe to make the craft smaller and more disc. A few proof-of-concept models were made by the engineer named Epp and gained the interest of the Berlin Ministry of Aviation in 1941. A facility was made near an airport in Prague, and a team was put together to make this circular prototype a reality. One of the first concepts made by this program was the Flugkreisel, with small wings extending from the central cabin and equipped with horizontal and vertical jets for propulsion. It weighed around 3 tons and was 42 feet in diameter. The aircraft were destroyed in 1945, shortly before the Russians invaded the area, so no records exist proving that it ever operated or worked. A Luftwaffe pilot named Otto Lange claimed to have piloted the craft multiple times. I couldn't find information on the Haunebu model in particular, but flying saucers were definitely an aim of the German Air Force. Schatzgraber, purpose. Schatzgraber, or Treasure Hunter was a weather station belonging to the German Navy that was erected in the Antarctic. It was used to predict the weather conditions in the sea above the USSR and detect storms that could ground Luftwaffe planes in the Eastern Front. It also helped detect Allied convoys that were making their way towards the USSR in order to support the Russian war effort. Himmler also intended for this station to be the nexus of German occult research in the Arctic Circle. The name of the station, Treasure Hunter, could have carried a double meaning, as it searched for vulnerable Allied convoys and for Nordic artifacts. No definite documents on its purpose had been discovered, and the station was abandoned later in the war after the station's assigned researchers fell ill after eating the raw remains of a polar bear. Lost Peking Man fossils. These fossils were unearthed by archaeological teams throughout the 1920s and 30s. Japan later invaded China, and the excavations were put on hold. The remains of the Peking Man fossils were given to the US for safekeeping. They were seen in their protective cases in December 1941 when they were handed over to US Marines. Since then, the boxes have gone missing. Fortunately, the cast of the original bones still remain, but overall, it's still a mystery as to what happened to those boxes. Submarine U-530 in U-977. On July 10, 1945, the commander of the U-boat U-530 arrived in Argentina and surrendered the submarine to the Argentine Navy. It was missing its deck gun. All of its crew had no identification, and documents on the boat from the previous 2 months had been heavily redacted before being handed over. The boat had last been seen 2 months previously in the Mediterranean. The voyage between its last recorded location and the port of Mar del Plata should have taken around 2 weeks, maybe a month tops with Allied stuff. Before the arrival of the boat at this location, a newspaper in Buenos Aires reported the sighting of a submarine north of the city, coming close to shore and letting a civilian and a man in a high-ranking officer's uniform disembark. I couldn't figure out or find any information on what gender the civilian was. These stories have prompted conspiracies that Hitler escaped to South America right before the end of the war. U-977 accompanied the other boat, was captured 30 miles off the coast of Mar del Plata. It was shown off to crowds along the eastern seaboard of the US, then abandoned and torpedoed off the coast of Cape Cod in 1946. Indian jungle hideouts. In 2015, researchers from the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina discovered 3 buildings in a jungle park. The buildings contained Nazi iconography etched into their foundations, fragments of porcelain plates originating from Germany, and coins that had been minted during the late 1930s. The site was just 10 minutes from the border in Paraguay and had been most likely set up by a commander who found the location perfect for chances to escape to other hideouts. In the end, the hideouts were abandoned after Argentina opened its borders to fleeing German immigrants and war criminals. Operation Tannenbaum. This was a plan that contained the steps for an Axis invasion of Switzerland. Switzerland laid in ideological opposition to the empires that soon surrounded it after the German operations in Europe. The plan was to use 11 German and 15 Italian divisions in the Jura region of western Switzerland, a number that would include as many as 500,000 troops. They would draw the Swiss out and then crush them. The assumption was that resistance would be light, and that the Swiss would capitulate with little bloodshed, like Austria. However, the Swiss were prepared, approving of a plan called the National Redoubt in 1939. This strategy called for their military assets to retreat into the mountains and force the invaders to mount a costly offensive up the heavily forested flanks of the Jura region. The bridges and tunnels were set with explosive charges, meaning that German armor would experience delay and then be limited by the terrain. But would include men from ages 18 up to the age of 60. Its fighters were told that any reports of surrender should be counted as enemy propaganda, and an army of marksmen supplied with well-made weapons, often bought from Germany, could enact a heavy toll on the Axis. Also, if the capital was captured, the individual townships could keep fighting, as the president and other heads of state had limited power in the government of Switzerland. In the end, the Axis decided to keep Switzerland as a neutral ally rather than Young Zhang. This Korean soldier was conscripted in 1938 and forced to fight for the Japanese Kwangtung Army. During battles in Manchuria against the Soviets, he was captured in 1939 and imprisoned in a Soviet POW camp. Due to the manpower shortages the USSR was experiencing, he was placed in a Russian unit and fought against the Germans multiple times throughout 1942 and 1943. Young was once again captured by the Germans in Ukraine and conscripted again. Young later settled in Cook County, Illinois, passing away in 1992. Blackout Killer. This is pretty easy to explain. George Cummins was a murderer who is accredited with the deaths of 4 to 6 people in the London blackouts in 1941 and 1942. Peschanka Bone Fields. This was supposedly an area near the city of Stalingrad in which 300,000 German bodies were placed after the conclusion of the war. Although this figure is very high, even for the bloody conflict of Stalingrad, it's said that the bones are still visible today, but the accounts of the bone fields are varying. Some say that they are still visible, but that is unlikely, as many years have passed since the conflict occurred. Thule Society. The Thule Society was founded in 1918 and had close ties with Hitler's group. It was known to feature occult elements, and its members were made out of influential businessmen, police chiefs, judges, and other figures of great significance in German society. It was fiercely anti-Semitic, and many men who were in this organization were prominent members of the Nazi Party. Its interest in myth and magic influenced some of the aesthetics and beliefs of later Nazi ideology. Air battle over Nis. In October 1944, American P-38 Lightnings engaged ground targets while helping Soviet forces in Yugoslavia. Unbeknownst to the pilots, they had actually attacked a Soviet position. The Russians scrambled Yak fighters to engage the P-38s, and a 15-minute dogfight took place between their forces. The Soviets sent everything they had, killing an unknown number of American pilots. The details of the incident remain classified. It is unknown how the Americans responded. Black Dragon Society. This group was an ultra-nationalist organization that lobbied for the militarization of Japan. It was in opposition to westernization in big business and the previous government. Members of this group advocated for a military government over the constitutional government of the Meiji Restoration. They were successful, using terror and assassination to silence or change the viewpoints of their enemies. The society has some deep background history leading back into the time of the Meiji Restoration, and the roots of this organization extended all over the world. At some point in the future, I might make a video covering this group, synarchism, and other more obscure societies and movements. The Black Dragon Society wasn't the sole reason Japan turned away from its former allies and embraced the extreme beliefs that drove it to war, but it was an element of why Japan joined the Axis and tried to expand to become the dominant leader of Southeast Asia. Syndrome K. It was 1943. Germany was eager to feed more souls into the maw of its concentration camp system. 10,000 Jews were captured in Italy during this time period and sent to the camps. In Rome, doctors were able to save at least 20 Jews from this fate. A hospital laid on a tiny island in the Tiber River, across from the ghetto area. A small group of Jews fled to this hospital, were given refuge and case files that read Syndrome K. This fake disease was made by an anti-fascist organizer named Adriano Assassini. The disease was claimed to be extremely infectious, and Jewish refugees in these designated syndrome rooms were told to cough whenever German soldiers entered the ward. The Germans were convinced, and this small group was preserved from death. Over 9,000 Jews, out of the Roman ghetto's estimated 10,000 inhabitants, were able to evade arrest throughout the war, due to the help the communities around them were willing to give. Werewolf Plan. As the war in the European theater neared its conclusion, Allied units began to spot this symbol scrawled on walls across the Franconia region of Germany. This was the mark of the werewolves, a group of partisans and paramilitary groups who fought to preserve the Nazi regime. They didn't achieve monumental gains, but were demoralizing to Allied units stationed in Germany. In 1945, Hitler drew on folklore to create this group, creating a doctrine that called for citizens to rise up at night and strike against enemy occupiers. After Otto Skorenzi's mission to liberate Mussolini in 1943, the value of small groups of trained commandos and paramilitary squads drew the interest of the German High Command. The purpose of the Werewolf Plan was to stem the Allied advance so that Germany could have the breathing room to possibly negotiate with the Allies. Radio broadcasts were sent out. The female broadcaster spurred the citizens into action with the phrase, "I am filled with rage. Lily the werewolf is my name. I bite, I eat, I am not tame. My teeth bite the enemy." While most of the German people were too weary to fight, the Allies had to deal with snipers, assassins, and holdouts who bothered their rear lines. These attacks went on well into 1947 in some parts of Germany, but the werewolves soon disappeared from public consciousness. After reading this entry, I think the comparison between this mythological creature and insurgents is an apt one. Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night. Heads up, this is for YouTube. This is for educational purposes and is in no way an endorsement of potential attacks on US soil. This is an informational video, not an instructional video. Known as Operation PX or Operation Sakura, this plan called for biological attacks on American West Coast cities using the bubonic plague. 5 Japanese submarines would be equipped with float planes, carrying bombs containing samples of the plague, or fleas carrying it. The planes would then coast and crash, releasing their contents in populated areas. The submarine crews would infect themselves and then run their craft into the shore to try to cause as much damage as possible. It was planned to occur in the month of September in 1945. Dr. Seuss goes to war. Theodore Geisel, well known for his children's books, served as a political cartoonist at the newspaper PM during World War II. They were supportive of the Allies and are pretty fascinating. They are examples of propaganda that hint at the later, more whimsical works Seuss would later produce. Some had the quote-unquote Yellow Peril caricature of the Japanese, which, despite its abhorrent nature, was very common at this point in time. British Pet Massacre. If animals in distress really bothers you, skip ahead about 30 seconds. In this event, over 750,000 household pets were euthanized in preparation for war against Germany. It was 1939, the very beginning of the war, and many were worried about their pets dying from air attacks and from the inevitable food shortages of a long war. The government had not intended for this to happen. Their objective was to euthanize farm animals and not household pets. Despite this, animals continued to be a massive part of the Allied efforts to raise morale. Project Pigeon. This was a pigeon-guided rocket conceived of in 1943. The US desperately wanted a guided weapon, and a psychologist named B.F. Skinner had a solution. He taught a group of pigeons how to guide weapons using a nose cone of a missile. Equipped with 3 tiny cockpits, the simulator had screens onto which military targets were projected in certain patterns. Using positive reinforcement, Skinner taught the birds how to recognize patterns and targets. The 3 pigeons would then be released, and then, by utilizing wires attached to each's head, peck at the viewport and guide the missile towards its intended target. The project was ended, but the pigeon nose cone bomb can be viewed at the Smithsonian. Ramree Island Crocodiles. This was the greatest crocodile attack in history, according to the Guinness Book of Records. In 1945, a group of 1,000 Japanese soldiers were cornered by the Allies in a swamp off the coast of present-day Myanmar. Unfortunately for them, the area was swarming with massive crocodiles, and only 20 men made it out alive, with roughly 900 eaten or mangled by crocodiles, and many others hit by American fire. This story is probably exaggerated. Japanese official reports stated that 500 men were able to make it out of the swamp alive, meaning the crocodile attack was probably on a great scale, but not as much as the Allied soldiers stated. Operation Alaska. This was an emergency plan drafted by the US government right before the end of the war. Many officials were concerned about the increasingly aggressive Soviet Union, and a contingency plan was produced in the event of the fall of Finland to the Communists, and the violence that would be wreaked on them by the victorious Russian forces. Operation Alaska would have accepted hundreds of thousands of Finnish refugees and placed them in central Alaska. If this took place, can you imagine the scenarios that would occur? I'm picturing that if the Cold War went hot in this timeline, the Russians would have had to face Finnish snipers defending Alaska with tooth and nail. Owl's Head bomber crash. This is an unverified story. Supposedly, in September 1944, an elderly couple were out walking near the Owl's Head Lighthouse in Maine. They noticed that a plane was approaching from the east. It was dark green and black, and had 6 engines on its wings. It was in trouble, making a slow descent until one of its wings dipped into the water, before disappearing from sight into the sea. An investigation was launched, but no wreckage was found in the area. 10 days later, 3 bodies washed ashore, attired in blue-gray uniforms. One had the insignia of a Luftwaffe captain, while others had yellow tabs on their clothing. The incident was said to have been covered up to preserve morale. If this is true, this might have been an example of an experimental Nazi bomber put into production that was said to be able to strike at the American deadly double ad. This was a strange advertisement that was placed in the November 22nd, 1941 edition of the New Yorker magazine. Starting with the headline, Achtung, warning, alert with an E. The ad talked about how the people of this game's company hoped readers never had to deal with living in a bomb shelter while air raids occurred, but the deadly double game could provide entertainment. 2 dice were shown off as part of the game, marked 12 and 7, the date of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Investigators later found that the company behind the product never existed, or at least appeared to at the time, and that a copy of the ad and the money for the newspaper had been mailed to the offices of the New Yorker, anonymously. Later on, it was discovered that this was in fact an omen that warned about the incoming Japanese surprise attack. After a few months, the man who produced the ad was discovered, a man by the name of Roger Paul Craig. His company claimed that the ads were just a coincidence and not malicious. Craig later went on to join the Office of Strategic Services during the war. Radio 1212. This was a propaganda station kept running by the U.S. Psychological Warfare Branch. After the liberation of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, the former German propaganda station was converted into an Allied black intelligence site. Named Nachsender 1212, the station opened in 1944 and started as a station seemingly supportive of the Axis forces. Its soothing nature of the hosts and stories of German victories enabled it to become popular to the weary German populace. Once it had secured a large audience, Nachsender 1212 aired misinformation on Allied movements and troop numbers to its listeners. It then aired a story where an actor played a frantic official who called for help, claiming that the German city the station was supposedly located in was being overrun by traitors, and sent messages for help. Its broadcasts ended after the station claimed that the Allies were outside the station, had secured control of the fictitious city. There's not a lot of information on the reactions to the station's final broadcasts, but I imagine many German listeners were unnerved by the charade. Unnerved by the Charade would make a great band name. Bought all the tea. In 1942, Britain was reeling from losses on the continent and in the Pacific theater. They had to have a way to raise the morale of their troops. Their solution was to buy all the tea available in Europe, and, by the end of the war, the British had bought more weight in tea than in artillery shells and explosives. The purchases had a massive positive influence on England, both in the home isles and abroad. Soldiers had the benefit of hydration, energy, and the comfort of normal routine in the midst of insane strife. Shindo Renmai. At the beginning of the war, the Japanese population in Brazil numbered around 200,000. Brazil was a partner who supported the Allied powers, who later declared war on the Axis after the sinking of multiple Brazilian vessels by German U-boats in the year 1942. Brazil cut its ties with Japan and imposed restrictions on the Japanese living within its territory. Any newspapers and radio shows were prohibited to be made to entertain or inform the Japanese community. Their native tongue was abolished, and no letters were allowed to be received. These communities thrived off of interaction, and the restrictions immediately affected them for the worse. As a result, a new terrorist group emerged. Established by a former Japanese colonel, Shindo Renmai, translating to the League of the Subject's Path, aimed to unite the Japanese into a unified nationalist group within Brazil. Acts of terror and sabotage were enacted to try to slow Brazil's production of materials for the Allies. These annoyed the Brazilian government, but Shindo Renmai became far more bloodthirsty after the surrender of Japan. Decrying the reports of Japan's surrender as propaganda, the members of the extremist group created lists of targets and claimed that Imperial Japan was still fighting. They attacked members of their own community who they considered treacherous. In the end, the group was crushed, and the Japanese in Brazil suffered because of the assassins. Body in the cylinder. In 1943, a work crew in Liverpool discovered a metal capsule measuring 6 feet in length. The crew had other objectives to complete, so the cylinder was laid aside and the remains of the cleared debris of buildings damaged during the German air raids. It remained there until July 1945. 3 boys discovered the remains of a man who had crawled into the capsule. His head laid on a brick wrapped in a sack. He was wearing high-class clothing from the Victorian era, and his pockets contained 2 diaries, papers, a signet ring, a postcard, a brooch, and a handkerchief. The postcard was addressed to one T.C. Williams. In 1885, Liverpool had a man who specialized in paint and brush manufacturing. He had declared bankruptcy the year before. The contents of the note seemed to indicate that the unidentified man had left home and had been sleeping in the cylinder at his place of work. He had most likely become trapped and then asphyxiated. This note, along with the fact that T.C. Williams had never been found and buried, suggested that the man was indeed Williams. Savitri Devi. This mystic was an agent of Nazi Germany throughout the 1940s, who helped spy on the Allies stationed in the subcontinent. She was a French woman who had later converted to Hinduism. She believed that Hitler was the avatar of the god Vishnu, sent to enact the end of the world. Interestingly, her mother was sympathetic to the French resistance, and the two often clashed. Tier 9. Weather Station Kurt. This weather station was established in the northern part of Labrador and transmitted weather conditions to German radio stations. The crew was delivered to their location by U-boat. The fact that it was the only German operation established in North America makes it distinguishable. The station was marked with letters that read Canadian Meteorological Service and had camouflage to deter those who spotted it. After a month of transmitting information, the station went silent and the crew was never seen again. The station remained hidden until a Smithsonian-sponsored archaeological team found it while performing a survey of the Labrador coast. It was assumed to be an abandoned Canadian station, till an amateur historian connected the dots between the station and the sightings of German U-boats in the area during the war. Interesting fact, from what I read, the Germans bought a bunch of packs of Lucky Strike cigarettes. I'm not sure where they got them, and they sprinkled the butts of them all over the beach. The idea was that they could make it look like an American unit was stationed there. Jean-Marie Lauri. This entry refers to a French railway worker whose mother told him that he was the product of an affair with a German soldier in 1917. Despite the young soldier's temper, his mother had found the young man's artistic skills attractive. She later gave birth and became embarrassed that she had had a child out of wedlock. Lauri's mother gave him away to an orphanage, and he was adopted and raised by another family. Lauri went on to participate in the French resistance and gained recognition as an agent for the Allies. Then his adopted mother revealed something that shocked him. She said His father, the young man she had conducted the affair with, was in fact Adolf Hitler. Lauri was hurt by this, and during the 1950s, he investigated to confirm if this was true. After a series of tests, the results seemed that it was likely. They had similar styles of handwriting, the same blood type, and shared physical similarities. People doubted this, but new evidence was discovered by researchers after Lauri's death in 1985, where Mott records were unearthed that revealed that envelopes of cash were sent to Lauri's mother. The family lawyer recently argued that Lauri's 3 children were eligible to receive royalties from Hitler's works. They politely declined the offer. Skeleton's Lake. In 1942, on the Indian border near Tibet, a British park ranger discovered a frozen lake surrounded by hundreds of human skeletons high in the mountains. Later on, the ice melted on the lake, revealed even more skeletal remains in the water and on the edges of the lake. Concerns grew that this was a group of dead Japanese soldiers who had tried to cross into India. The British grew worried that this was evidence for a land invasion and sent a team to investigate. Further examination revealed that these were not the bodies of Japanese soldiers, but were in fact far older, dating to around 850 AD. A 2004 study revealed the estimated age and determined the cause of death. Analysis of the skulls revealed that all had died from a blow to the head, but the short and deep cracks in the skulls suggested the victims had been hit by round, hard objects instead of weapons. Wounds were found in the head and shoulders of the specimens. These people were most likely a group of travelers who had died from a freak hailstorm that happened so fast that they had no time in which to seek shelter. Subhas Chandra Bose. Bose was an Indian political figure who had opposing views on how to liberate India compared to the movement led by Gandhi. He was exiled from India and helped the Axis with propaganda throughout the war. Bose was later covertly moved from Germany to Tokyo and took command of a Japanese-backed army of 40,000 troops. He marched on India, but was quickly defeated by Allied forces due to the lack of air support on his side. Bose lost the favor of the Japanese and died from burn injuries after his plane crashed in Taiwan. Operation Cone of Power. It was a few hours before midnight on August 1st, 1940, a day that was a date of ritual significance for British members of the neo-pagan religion of Wicca. England had suffered defeat after defeat, and Dunkirk had just taken place. A group of witches and occultists performed a ritual to psychically attack the mind of Hitler. In the past, during the assault of the Spanish Armada, and later on in the Napoleonic Wars, witches have been said to gather to cast spells to defend the home islands. People who have written on this event claim that the spell had worked and had prevented Hitler from deciding to cross the Channel. This event gained the joke moniker Operation Cone of Power among the British. Hitler was the second Antichrist. This theory claims that Nostradamus predicted the rise of the dictator. This theory was also made about Napoleon, so I doubt he was the mythical figure discussed in Revelations. Mussolini Diaries. In the past, supposed copies of the Italian dictator's journals have been discovered. In every case, they have been found to be false. Most recent one, quote-unquote, discovered in 2007, paints the dictator as a manly man who was forced to join the Axis. It was pretty much a fanfic for this guy. Presents him as this virtuous poetical person throughout its entries, but Mussolini was a completely different figure from the one depicted in those falsified papers. Sword of Islam. This was a ceremonial sword given to Mussolini by Libyan Muslims to celebrate the facilities he had created to felicitate pilgrimages to Mecca and Medina. It was kept in one of the dictator's residences before disappearing in 1943. Battle of the Bulge, Christmas Truce. This entry refers to an event reported to have happened on Christmas Eve 1944, near the German border with Belgium. A young boy named Fritz Winken and his mother lived in a small hunting cottage outside of a nearby town in an effort to avoid Allied air raids. The father was part of the Civil Defense Guard and was in the town at the time. The Battle of the Bulge was underway, and planes filled the sky near the cottage, and the screams of dying men and the rumble of tanks could be heard nearby. One evening, a knock came at the door. The mother answered the door and found two men in uniform outside of it. They spoke in a language they couldn't understand, and motioned towards a third man lying in the snow. One of the men spoke French, so the mother was able to communicate with them. The family brought them in, and the boy treated the men's freezing feet while the mother took care of the third wounded guy. The mother took the family rooster and some potatoes, and the boy prepared a meal with the help of one of the soldiers, named Jim. As Fritz and one of the soldiers were setting the table, another knock came at the door. Expecting to see more Americans, the mother found a group of 4 German soldiers at the door. They asked if they could stay the night, but the mother explained the situation. She said that she would allow them in if they left their weapons on the woodpile outside of the home. They agreed, and laid all their weapons down to enjoy dinner. It turned out that the men from both sides were between the ages of 16 and 18, except for a German corporal who was 23. One of the Germans took notice of the wounded GI, and he examined the man. Fritz asked if he was a medic. The soldier said no, but he had studied medicine in a city called Heidelberg before the war, and he determined that blood loss was occurring, provided an antidote, rest, and food. Here's the rest of the story, taken from the original article published by Fritz Winken in a January 1973 edition of Reader's Digest. Mother said grace. I noticed that there were tears in her eyes as she said the old familiar words, "Come, Herr Jesus, be our guest." And as I looked around the table, I saw tears too, in the eyes of the battle-weary soldiers, boys again, some from America, some from Germany, all far from home. Just before midnight, Mother went to the doorstep and asked us to join her to look up at the Star of Bethlehem. We all stood beside her except Harry, the wounded man, who was sleeping. For all of us during the moment of silence, looking at the brightest star in the heavens, the war was a distant, almost forgotten thing. Our private armistice continued next morning. Harry woke in the early hours and swallowed some broth that Mother fed him. With the dawn, it was apparent that he was becoming stronger. Mother now made him an invigorating drink from our one egg, the rest of the corporal's wine, and some sugar. Everyone else had oatmeal. Afterward, 2 poles and Mother's best tablecloth were fashioned into a stretcher for Harry. The German corporal then advised the Americans on how to find their way back to their lines. Looking over Jim's map, the corporal pointed out a stream. "Continue along this creek," he said. "You will find the First Army rebuilding its forces on the upper course." The medical student relayed the information in English. "Why don't we head for Monschau?" Jim had the student ask. "Nein," the corporal exclaimed. "We've retaken Monschau." Now Mother gave them back their weapons. "Be careful, boys," she said. "I want you to get home someday, where you belong. God bless you all." The German and American soldiers shook hands, and we watched them disappear in opposite directions. The Guyana Project. This was a Nazi-controlled area of the Amazon claimed by the exploratory forces of Germany in 1936 to provide a space for German settlers. While under the legitimate guise of securing and looking for archaeological sites, a party led by Otto Schultz-Kampf-Fenkel, a political officer, zoologist, filmmaker, and adherent to the beliefs of the regime. The mission did not go well. The seaplane supplied to the team capsized at the beginning of their expedition, leaving them at the mercy of their environment. Only a few people in the expedition survived, as many of them were taken out by disease. The tract of land was later taken by Brazil. Tier 10. The final tier. Benga Island Massacre Cover-Up. This event occurred in 1942. A group of 22 Australian nurses were shot by Japanese soldiers in Indonesia, and only a single nurse survived to escape and tell the story of what happened. The nurses had been assaulted by the Japanese beforehand, and this fact was kept concealed for decades by Allied tribunals who chose to avoid the crimes committed against the victims before their deaths. The accounts of the survivor were censored to remove any mention of these acts, to the detriment of the single person who made it out alive, Hexen Kartothek. This word translates to the phrase, "witch library." Ordered by Himmler, a Nazi official who was obsessed with the occult, researchers spent time collecting information on past historical witch trials. His goal was to prove that the Catholic Church had used these trials to extinguish the German pagan heritage. Himmler also wanted a book published how the Church had oppressed the pagans by burning the occult. In the end, the project was inconclusive and faded into obscurity. Still, I find it fascinating that many of these occult entries are connected to Himmler. Werner Heisenberg, Niels Bohr conversation. I'm guessing the Iceberg author was a fan of Bohr, as he's shown up twice on this iceberg. Look at those eyes. They bore into your soul. Walter Heisenberg made major contributions that led to German researchers discovering neutron multiplication, meaning that elements could power an explosive weapon, an atom bomb. Heisenberg helped the German weapons program and was great friends with Niels Bohr. Heisenberg had a conversation with Bohr while at a conference in Copenhagen. No one knows what he told him, but Bohr came away from the meeting distraught. Did Heisenberg ask for his help with Germany's atomic weapons program? Did he warn him of what the Germans were doing? It's not clear. Also, this guy inspired the alias of Walter White. I think this was a deliberate Breaking Bad reference. Japanese colonies in Mexico. Mexico featured a small Japanese community. In 1942, fearing that the Japanese would help their home country, over 5,000 Japanese Mexican citizens were sent to internment camps in Mexico City. In 1944, the government permitted them to return home, but many of their homes had been claimed by other citizens who refused to give them up. They were left without places to settle, so many returned to Mexico City. As a result, many of these communities are centered around Mexico City in the present day. Nazi nuke test at Rugen Island. Supposedly, the Nazis beat the Allies to nuclear weapons, but theirs were less refined and did not have an effective delivery system during the war. The evidence is a series of concentration camp inmates found dead from intense radiation exposure, who were used in experiments on the island of Rugen in the Baltic Sea. These weapons were far less powerful than Allied designs and are comparable to modern dirty bombs. These were low-yield, but immensely deadly. It appears that Germany may have had the facilities in place for atomic weapons, but lacked access to higher-grade resources like the US. This theory was produced in a book called Hitler's Bomb by the historian Rainier Karlsch. Another incident has also pointed towards a more developed Nazi atomic weapons program. A treasure hunter in northeast Germany discovered a lump of highly radioactive metal in 2017. This area, near Oranienburg, has been recorded as being a former uranium enrichment facility from the 1940s. Also, a file from the US National Archives recorded the testimony of a German pilot named Hans Zinser. Here is his testimony. In early October 1944, I flew 12 to 15 kilometers from a nuclear test station near Lugwitzlust, south of Lübeck. A cloud shaped like a mushroom with turbulent, billowing sections at about 7,000 meters stood, without any seeming connections over the spot where the explosion took place. Strong electrical disturbances, the impossibility to continue radio communication, as by lighting turned up. Do you believe that Germany was this advanced in its weapons program? Let me hear your thoughts in the comments below. Malbork mass graves. In 2009, over 1,800 bodies were unearthed in a mass grave in Malbork, Poland. The remains were of civilians and children of all ages, and dated to the end of the war. No personal belongings were found with the dead, and it appears many perished from starvation and hypothermia. The city was known as Marienburg at the time, and was the site of heavy fighting between the Germans and the Russians. This conflict occurred before the estimated time of death of these people, and no reports have been discovered about this event. The circumstances and reasons for the mass grave remain unknown. Operation Overlord Crossword Puzzle Incident. The Allies were preparing for D-Day and the liberation of Europe. Secrecy veiled every part of the operation in order to maintain the element of surprise. In May 1944, 1 month before the operation, a group of MI5 agents, members of the British Counterintelligence Service, were working on some crossword puzzles in the Telegraph. They then noticed that multiple code names that protected parts of the D-Day operation were all throughout the puzzle. Utah and Omaha, names of two of the beaches during the invasion, were answers to questions. Mulberry, the code name for the floating harbor that was to accompany the Allies, was another answer, along with Overlord, the name of the entire plan. This was immensely suspicious, and High Command was worried that the Germans were being warned of the invasion. Agents were sent to the home of the man who had put together the puzzle, a man named Leonard Daw. He was indignant. After many hours of interrogation, MI5 determined that he was innocent, that the entire incident was merely a coincidence. New Swabia. This was an area of land in the Antarctic claimed by Germany in the late 1930s. It was abandoned for much of the war, but kept its name even after the fall of the Reich. The US used this area to perform some training in the late 40s, with a massive training called Operation High Jump taking place in the winter of 1946. Nuclear blasts took place here as well, as the US covertly experimented with high-altitude nuclear explosions in the 60s. Later on, conspiracy theorists grew around the idea of a Nazi secret base being developed in New Swabia. They also claimed that U-530, U-977 traveled to this area to drop off supplies and important personnel before surrendering in South America. Allegedly, a secret weapons program was developed in the Antarctic. There were claims that Operation High Jump was an assault on the base that was repulsed by flying saucers, nuclear bombs, and other superweapons. It's claimed that a colony lies in the caves beneath this area of the continent. Bonus tier. After I completed the Iceberg, I realized that there were many cool stories and events that the Iceberg author had missed, and I had missed as well. I'm not going to cover every interesting thing the Iceberg missed, but in this video and future ones, I will include a handful of entries that were not covered by the author or that I had somehow missed and still found compelling. There are many interesting stories. I would be here a lot longer if I covered every single one I could find. This is the bonus tier. world ice theory caused the German defeat at Stalingrad. This isn't completely confirmed, but historians believe that some of the tenets of Hitler's regime influenced their campaign in Russia from the winter of 1941 to 1942. The rhetoric of the Aryan master race was accepted by many commanders in the German command structure, and the men equipping the units participating in the invasion distributed inadequate winter gear. This may have been due to the popularity of world ice theory, a tale that was the backbone of party mythology. It was said that the Aryans were the sole survivors of a catastrophic event, in which a block of ice collided with the Earth and caused a flood in a subsequent ice age. The supposed master race of the Aryans were said to be more resistant to the cold, so many German troops were given little protection from the harsh winter conditions. Some have argued that this sense of superiority may have cost the Germans the critical battle of Stalingrad. Plan Rubber. This was an Allied contingency plan that called for the invasion of Brazil. This was drafted in 1941, when the US grew concerned that the Germans could link up with the authoritarian government of Brazil if they moved through the Vichy-occupied elements of Africa and came within airplane range of the Brazilian coast. By seizing northeastern Brazil, Allied convoys could be staged off the coast and led into the Far East if the Japanese continued to expand their territory in the Pacific, which would cut off trade. Overland attacks would have seized coastal cities, as ships like the USS Texas provided covering fire for Marine amphibious divisions. It would have been very difficult for the invaders, as the ports were hard to access and could be easily reinforced by other Brazilian regiments if the specifics of the plan were leaked. In the end, the plan was rendered moot after Brazil allowed US troops to be stationed in the north, and a pact was signed by both countries. Escape from Sobibor. Camp Sobibor was part of the network of sites dedicated to the murder of the Jews. In 1943, the inmates of the camp noticed a decline in how many people were being sent to the gas chambers. This sparked rumors that the Germans were going to dismantle the camp and liquidate all of the prisoners. A committee was established to devise a plan of escape. However, the leaders of the council had limited combat experience, and they made little progress. This changed in September 1943, when Jewish POWs who were veterans from the Red Army were placed in Sobibor. The committee reached out to them, and within 3 weeks, a new plan was drawn up. The POWs would first take out the officers, disguise themselves in the officers' uniforms, arm themselves with their weapons, and would wait until evening roll call. When the prisoners were gathered, the disguised men would take out the guards at the roll call, those guarding the gate, and the individuals in the towers. A revolt would occur on a day when the camp commandant and many other important officials would be away. The operation did not go well. While the officers were taken out successfully, the remaining guards opened fire into the gathered prisoners at roll call. Only about 50 Jewish inmates were able to make it out successfully. Russian white émigrés in the Charlemagne Division. Many white Russians who had escaped the Soviet takeover of Russia went on to join the division sent to Russia as part of Operation Barbarossa, including the more fanatical and highly trained military arms of the invading German forces, the ones with the funny electrician logo. In fact, many Russian names can be found amidst the personnel lists of the German archives. Seeking out these names has been the focus of a group called Feldgrau, and it appears that many white Russians held positions in the different divisions deployed to the east. Kugo. The death ray, also referred to as the peace ray by Nikola Tesla, was the concept for an electromagnetic weapon that would use charged particles to be able to defend against planes from distances up to 200 miles. It was designed by Nikola Tesla. An article discussing the weapon was published in 1934 and drew the attention of the Japanese. Yamamoto was intrigued and tapped a physicist named Ioji Ito to head an experimental weapons project. Ito had spent years studying the development of the German atomic program, and after reading more into Tesla's design, found that it was impossible to create a station that could produce that much electromagnetic energy. He turned to magnets instead. A weapon was planned that could fire a condensed beam of radio waves that was said to be able to physically harm enemy combatants, and was thought to be able to stop small car engines. In 1944, the Kugo was produced, a radio transmitter that could stop weak car engines. It took a long time to kill its victims, with separate tests conducted on small animals at ranges up to a mile. While primitive, the Kugo was the closest any country during World War II got to creating a death ray. Smoking snakes. This entry refers to a Brazilian expeditionary force that was sent to assist the Allies in conquering Italy. They captured many key positions and helped open the path to northern Italy. At the time, the phrase, "when snakes smoke," was a popular alternative to the expression, "when pigs fly." The expeditionary force adopted a smoking snake as their logo and namesake. The unit lost 450 soldiers out of their complement of 23,000 men, while capturing 20,573 Axis soldiers. The unit even has its own Sabaton song, which commemorates an event which 3 Brazilians held off an entire German battalion single-handedly. It must have been terrifying for the Germans, as Brazilians can indeed double jump. Thank you so much for watching. If you watched this far, thank you. This was a lot of fun to make, and I'm proud to have made something that is both the channel's first hour-long video, and also 2-hour-long video. If you enjoyed this, please consider liking the video and checking out the other stuff I've made in the past. After writing this script, I'm struck by the fact that you can spend so much time researching World War II and still be able to find new events that occurred. I'll see you next time. Take care, and good night.